Hi gang, I'm going to be talking today about this book, Decolonizing Methodologies, which is now in its second edition. The first edition came out in 1999 and the second in 2012. Not a lot of substantial differences, just some updated passages. The book is written by Linda Tuwei Smith, and she writes the book from two perspectives, first as a researcher and second as a Maori woman. And this intersection is filled with tensions because indigenous peoples, colonized peoples often think of research as, well, she says it's one of the dirtiest words in the vocabulary because they have the tormented history with research and researchers having been the object of some pretty shady research projects. I bought the book for 26 bucks. On Amazon, and I know we spend a lot of money on books, so I tried to be thorough with my summary so that you can look at the summary, and if you want the Reader's Digest version, just read the first line or two of each paragraph, and if you want a more thorough summary so you can determine if the book is worth buying for you, maybe for a research project or for your quals book list, then I hope my summary is useful to you for that reason. So the book is divided basically into two sections with a transition chapter. The first part of the book discusses indigenous histories and stories of being researched. It explains the modern indigenous condition and as it's framed by imperialism. She challenges the post-colonial notion. The idea that we're somehow post or beyond colonialism, which she says is alive and thriving today. And instead, she talks about decolonizing as being this long and deliberate transformative process, but that she doesn't think that we'll ever escape or be beyond or post the influence of colonialism. So Smith, in her book, offers strategies for decolonizing societies, for advancing the interests of indigenous peoples, which she says she defines what the interests are and ought to be according to her, but also acknowledges that indigenous cultures aren't monocultures. They're not made up of a monolithic group of people who all have the same idea and share ideas of what their interests are and ought to be. So there's difference there, and she's okay with that. She just acknowledges that. So in the Western tradition of research and discovery, discovery, right, didn't always mean actually being the first to know something, to discover something, but to discover according to Western elite standards, and to, if we didn't know it, then it was unknown, right? And this erases the idea of indigenous experience. So not only that, but research is this really specialized, pretty formulaic way of knowing and doing with a specialized vocabulary that kind of erases indigenous ways of doing and knowing, and excludes people from the community. So in a way, research then becomes, or research discourse at least, becomes a rhetoric of erasure. So acknowledging this past, she then thinks about the current condition in chapter 5, and then moves forward and thinks ahead about what should we be doing in the future, in the near and long-term future, in chapters 6 through 12. So with that, the second part of the book wrestles with indigenous ways indigenous communities might interrupt political power structures, systems and attitudes that perpetuate poor conditions for indigenous peoples. She lays out specific strategies for mobilizing indigenous peoples and getting them to collaborate, cooperate with their allies in research and activism. So she said that indigenous research should move beyond survival and healing toward development and self-determination. research should involve participation, not merely observation of indigenous peoples, and that they should be involved in some of the decision-making process. So the big takeaway here is that sites of research and research they're not neutral spaces. There are no neutral spaces for research. So what are the implications for our class? What should we be taking away, the 9 or 10 of us in archival methods? Well, Western research practices favor formal and standardized ways of collecting, archiving, recording, retrieving, reporting data, right? And these standardized systems privilege those who are designing, organizing, and retrieving from those archives. We then have authority or influence, and more influence than the objects themselves that we are studying. And often these objects are artifacts, documents coming from indigenous communities. So how can we balance that and give more fair structures or systems? So Foucault suggests that the West is a cultural archive, a repository of Western knowledge, and the archive reveals rules of practice which the West itself cannot necessarily describe because it operates with the rules and they are taken for granted. That quote is on page 46 of this book, by the way. The aim of research then is to expand knowledge, and the goal of the archive is to facilitate that expansion. So it's possible we are accustomed to Western research practices in such a way that the power structures have become invisible to us. So our archives colonize spaces. And if so, how can we disrupt the power structures in the archive? Or more broadly, how can we disrupt the power structures in the academy? Even if we aren't doing indigenous research, Decolonizing Methodologies is an important book because it gets us thinking about the ethics of vulnerability. And our bodies, our human condition necessitates that at some point we will be vulnerable, all of us. Our minds and our bodies are fragile. The societies we live in are fragile. So we all have a stake in the ethics of vulnerability. We all should read Decolonizing Methodologies to get a better perspective of what that means. Anyway, thanks for listening. See you, bye.